Welcome, everyone. My name's Hugh Ellis, and I'm Director of Policy at the TCPA. And it's a real pleasure to welcome you to this hour-long webinar that we're conducting between the TCPA and the Environment Agency on an introduction to coastal planning for planners in coastal authorities. I'm going to say some brief words of introduction and a little bit of housekeeping. The session's quite focused. It's an hour, and we'll come to the agenda in a second. But we will be using Slido, which you will have a link for both for our Q&A function. So if it's okay, if you can put questions for this session into the Slido link that you have, that would be great, rather than into the Zoom. So this session will run an hour. Let's move on. Next slide, please, and look at the agenda. You'll be really all relieved to know a very brief introduction from me. And then we've got some fantastic members of staff from the Environment Agency who are going to take us through some of the key introductory issues around coastal planning, both in terms of shoreline management plans and the National Coastal Erosion Risk Management Strategy. And then we're going to be able to do some Q&As at the end of that process. It's really important that this is an introductory session and that there is a more detailed session which will run on Thursday. There's also a session for elected members tomorrow as part of this. And this is part of a wider strategy which we're supporting the Environment Agency on in communicating this kind of really critically important issue. My only words of introduction about this will be very brief. It is traditional for us to say at the TCPA that climate change is an existential threat. You all know that, and there's really no need to repeat it. But I think in a time when politically things are becoming more interesting in local government, to say the least, it's important to say that the practical consequences of that threat is that climate change is between us and the delivery of all sorts of objectives which local and national politicians have. And unless we get to grips with it effectively, we can't deliver housing, we can't deliver health, because the challenges of climate change is to constantly undermine the quality and sustainability of what we're trying to achieve, unless we can build highly resilient places and get on top of emissions. And I suppose that in relation to why the focus on coastal planning over this week, that those coastal communities face some of the highest levels of climate change threat anywhere, particularly in terms of sea level rise and particularly in terms of storm surge. These are places that are on the front line of the adaptation battle. And it's critically important that you take a long-term approach and completely prioritize climate change in all of the planning processes that move forward. There is tremendous amount of reform in planning going on at the moment, sometimes feels migraine-inducing, the level of change happening. But the core message of these sessions is that the evidence base and the priority around climate change are absolutely critical, and so critical in relation to coastal planning. So, looking at the agenda, we're going to be having presentations from Nick Hardiman and Rachel Clark-Wood in relation to the sort of overview about how we should be deploying instruments like shoreline management plans and how they can fit into your local planning processes. And then we will deal with a Q&A for which there should be about 20 minutes. But before all of that, I'm going to hand over to Eleanor, who's going to introduce the first part of our Slido. What should we call it, Eleanor? Quiz, poll? Over to you.
We'll go for poll.
Yeah.
Thanks very much, Hugh. And good afternoon, everyone. Great to see the numbers of people dialing in. We really appreciate you spending the time to come and listen to us this afternoon. So I'm Eleanor Blundell. I work in the Coastal Resilience team in the Environment Agency. I lead on sort of partnerships and engagement, that kind of thing. So I will be your Slido host for this afternoon. So as details have been put in the chat, you can go to Slido, so that's slido.com, so slido.com, and use the code TCPA1, and that's the number 1 at the end to access today's session. So if you've not used Slido before, you can use it on your phone or your computer, whichever digital device you'd like to use. And at the moment, you'll see 2 tabs. So there's the Q&A tab. So that will remain open for the whole session. So pop any Q&A in there and we'll look at getting round to that when we come to the Q&A. You can also use the little thumbs up to upvote the questions, and we'll see what we can do in terms of coming to those most voted for questions when we get to them. And for now, there's also a poll open. There'll be one now and one at the end. So I can see we've already had 33 votes in there. So great to see some of you already logged on, getting ready to use Slido. So at the moment, if we could flick on a slide, it might be two slides actually. We've got a poll there around, have you heard of shoreline management plans and the National Coastal Erosion Risk Map? So a bit of a multiple choice there. If we'll keep that open for the next couple of minutes and you can pop that in there. We're not sharing the results live, but if you are on Slido, you should be able to see those votes popping up as we go on. So if you could pop your votes in there, I can see we're up to 62 now, so that's lots of you getting to use Slido. So a good test for you to make sure Slido works. And just we use Slido quite a lot. It helps us track all the questions and answers we get throughout all of our work. So if you've ever joined any of our NCERM webinars, yeah, we used it through that, and it's been a really great resource for us to come back to. So we'll definitely be doing that for this as well. So thank you very much for getting involved. Thanks for coming today. And I'm going to pass on to Nick Hardiman from the Environment Agency to start us off from the EA point of view. Over to you, Nick.
Thanks very much, Eleanor. If we can just pop on to the next slide, please. My name's Nick Hardiman. Good afternoon, everybody. I work in what is an umbrella team in the Environment Agency, the National Directorate in Flood and Coastal Erosion Risk Management, and it's called Strategic Overview because that is what the Environment Agency has for all forms of flooding and erosion risk. Even though local authorities manage erosion and surface water flooding and so forth more directly, we have an overview for it, and a lot of what we're going to be talking about in the next half an hour really comes under what our remit within that strategic overview. I'm an expert advisor on coast. I've been working at the Environment Agency for about 16 years now on coastal matters, and I have a background in erosion risk mapping, shoreline management planning, habitat creation and adaptation. So if we go on to the next slide, please. A little bit more about that strategic overview. So we have had that since 2008, and at first we had to grapple with exactly what it meant, but essentially it comes under about four pillars, if you like. The first is evidence. So we generate and communicate coastal risk through our digital services. We also have all of this for inland work as well, but of course we are talking about the coast today. You'll hear a lot about that in the next presentation from Rachel Clark-Wood, and also about the next bullet, which is the second pillar of our overview, and that is around strategic planning. So we set the strategic direction for how coastal risk is managed through our national strategy. And I say our national strategy, it's not just the Environment Agency, it's a lot of different parties that are involved in that. And we also approved shoreline management plans. So those have been mentioned already. And those were produced between about 2006 and about 2011. And they set the long-term direction of travel for coastal management throughout England. They're also in Wales as well, but of course we're just talking about England here. We deliver coastal resilience and adaptation through allocating and approving investment in coastal projects and programs. This is a key part of our overview. So we've used the evidence that we've commissioned and communicated, and we have set out long-term plans with our partners. And we then allocate and approve investment aligned to those plans. So it's a really important kind of narrative, if you like, going from the evidence through the planning into what we actually do and what we pay for. An important subset, I would say, of that investment is the next bullet, which is delivering and promoting nature-based solutions. We've separated that one out here a little bit because it's going to be quite a key feature of our next investment programme, which we're currently devising at the moment, again, very much in conversation with partners. And we are putting our bids through to government and trying to work it all out. This is going to set the tone for the next 4 or 5 years. And we want nature-based solutions to flooding and erosion risk to be more prominent and mainstreamed. Part of how we deliver environmental outcomes is through our habitat compensation and restoration programme. Now, that has traditionally focused on keeping the rest of our investment legal. In other words, the habitat regulations do say that if you damage or destroy internationally protected sites, then you have to compensate for that loss. Now, of course, flooding and erosion risk management does destroy those habitats through, yes, direct loss through projects that we do, but also coastal squeeze, where you have the loss of habitats into tidal habitats running up against defences where they would naturally migrate inland. The defences stop them from doing that. So we have a programme to compensate for those losses, and that leads to some great schemes like you might have heard of Medmarie on the south coast, or Sturt in the southwest, Wallasey Island in Essex. Those are some of the more well-known examples, but there are many, many others. And that has created some great habitat at the coast, but it's also helped to manage flood risk at the coast. In many cases, those nature-based solutions do actually provide flood risk benefits, as well as a whole host of other ones, like obviously water quality and amenity and well-being for people. And as planners, you are going to have that at the forefront of your mind. At the beginning, we heard about how climate change is going to be pivotal for planning. That is written through our coastal risk evidence, as you'll hear. It's written through our shoreline management planning. And we allocate investment according to proper consideration of climate change allowances, particularly sea level rise at the coast. But you're also wanting to be thinking about, yes, adaptability and using nature to help adapt to climate change, but also nature, not just climate change. A lot when people talk about the environment nowadays, it's always climate change, isn't it? What about wildlife and nature? Well, those have got to be so prominent in our thinking about how we manage risk, including flood and coastal erosion risk, to communities, but also at the same time make places and shape places where they want to live, and they have that well-being advantage and that health advantage and all the other benefits that come through having more connectivity to the natural environment and wildlife. And we managed to help contribute to resolving our ecological crisis as well as the climate crisis. The last one I've talked about a lot through all of that, which is partnership working, and that is the fourth pillar I always think of our strategic overview, and that is joined up working with coastal authorities. Those are coast protection authorities who manage erosion, also local planning authorities are often the same authority in reality, and other partners, DEFRA agencies, but many NGOs and a whole host of other delivery partners who we need to help manage coastal risk. And it could be infrastructure providers, it could be all sorts. And coastal groups, which are voluntary groups essentially that work at a regional basis, are key mechanisms for doing that. And those have existed since the Coastal Overview was formed and before. And they bring together those authorities and partners together to talk through this, talk through the investment programme and so forth. If you go on to the next slide, please. In terms of that coastal risk bit, well, we produced key products around improving the picture of that. Last December, we published a report explaining how flood and coastal erosion risk is changing across England and why. That summarised a few years' work on improving and updating very comprehensively both our erosion risk maps, which were also originally produced during the same time as Shoreline Management Plans in their current generation, between about 2007 and 2011. And the National Flood Risk Assessment, NAFRA. So NCERM, National Coastal Erosion Risk Map, and NAFRA, National Flood Risk Assessment. And in updating those products, they obviously gave us a new picture of what was at risk from erosion and flooding across the country. And that report summarises that. So if you haven't seen that, then it's easily available on gov.uk. And it will give you the story, if you like, behind the data sets. So in terms of those data sets, we have the erosion risk mapping, and that came out in January this year, and that was published on the Shoreline Management Plan Explorer. The SMP Explorer is a new tool to help you get to the shoreline management plan information much more quickly and easily. You just put a postcode in and it takes you where you want to go, and you can see the erosion risk, you can see the management approaches in that location. So again, gov.uk, you can easily find it and bring that up, and I do encourage you to look at that. More on that later from Rachel. And we published an updated flood zones on flood map for planning, which came later in the spring. Okay, next slide, please. What does that tell us? So that report gives a lot of figures, a lot of information about different receptors, but in summary, looking at the headlines for flooding, 6.3 million properties are in areas of risk of flooding from at least one of the principal sources: rivers, the sea, and surface water. It used to be our assessments saying that 5.5 million were at risk. That's obviously an increase in that. And that's going to be partly driven by the new data, and particularly on surface water and flood depths. In terms of climate change, that adds more. So 8 million properties could be in areas at risk from at least one of the principal sources by the middle of the century. If you go on to the next slide, you have similar headlines for erosion. Again, increases. So 3,500 properties in areas of risk of coastal erosion in the period up to the middle of the century. But if you don't deliver those shoreline management plans, if we were to literally just sit back and not do anything and let assets deteriorate, then that would rise to 32,800. So it really shows the benefits of our coastal investment. Again, climate change, even if we do invest in those SMPs, could put the risk to 19,700. So some really big figures there that we really need to grapple with. Okay, I'm going to finish there. That's just a brief summary, which I hope has been helpful. I'm going to hand over to Rachel Clark-Wood, who is the technical lead on the shoreline management planning work in our team, and she will go into the SMPs in more detail. Over to you, Rachel.
Thanks, Nick. Hi, everyone. Next slide, please. Yeah, so as Nick said and introduced me, I'm Rachel Clark-Wood. So sit in the same team, the same directorate as Nick and Eleanor. And as Nick stated, I'm technical lead for everything SMP world. So you're going to hear from me on SMP. So I'll go into some of the detail around what they are, how they've been refreshed and what we're doing with them next. And then I'll speak to you about some of the NCERM detail as well. So just looking at the polls, it's quite interesting. So a third of you have heard of SMPs, but not NCERM. So this will be really relevant to you. And also some of you have not heard of either. 2/3 of you have heard of both SMPs and NCERM. So hopefully this will provide a refresh and a bit of a reminder of what they are and where we're going with them, and what's been done and where you can find some of the information to assist you in your role. So next slide, please, comments. So I'll just go back to an introduction on what SMPs are and give you some of that background information. So SMPs, what are they? So they set out that planned approach to managing flood and coastal erosion risk around the coast of England. There are 20 SMPs, as you can see on screen there, 2 that cover the Welsh borders for north and south, and then you've got 2 specific ones for Wales itself, but we're just looking at the 20 at the moment. We've covered all 22 on that map, as you can see on screen there. They were published between 2006 and 2012, and as it says on screen there, they're mutually owned. So these were developed in partnership by the Environment Agency, local authorities, and coastal groups and coastal partners. And they use that local evidence to identify the management approach over the 3 planning timeframes. So we've got the short, the medium, and the long term. You might have heard these referred to as epochs. We're moving to the terminology, as you can see on screen now. As you can see, we're now in that medium term timeframe. So that's something to consider as well when you're looking at the SMPs for your area in your role. Obviously, what's happening now, which I'll give you some more detail on how to obviously find that information and obviously use it within your role as well. Next slide, please. So just some information on implementing shoreline management plans. So the EA, local authorities and other partners with an interest on the coast use these to inform, as you can see on screen there, local plans and development decisions. So obviously this is relevant to the majority of you on the call. Habitat creation and restoration, as Nick mentioned and went through previously, and obviously those coastal management investment decisions on the coast as well. Each of the SMPs contains an action plan, and that outlines the short-term and some of the longer-term actions to get those management approaches delivered and off the ground. And they also identify key actions on engagement that are needed in the area, monitoring and research, and implementation planning. And all those can be viewed on SMP Explorer, the specific drop-downs to view those actions for the SMP at the whole level, and also the SMP at the more unitary level as well. There is an agreed change process for if there are any changes that need to be made to any of the management approaches. And the guidance for this is available on SMP Explorer. We are working on some of the guidance as well, just to assist the change process, to make it a bit more transparent, a bit more easier to do. And I'll discuss some of that in the next step slide when I get to that. Next slide, please. So SMP Refresh, some of you may have heard of this. So this was a large project that started in 2017. We worked with the coastal groups to identify that need, that actually the SMPs needed to be updated, needed to be made more accessible. And it wasn't a full rewrite of all the SMPs, but instead, as it says on screen there, a refresh. And that's where we started that in 2017. As you may remember, the date of the SMPs that they implemented and came to life and came to fruition between 2006, 2012. And as we know, a lot have happened between that time, right up until 2017. So this is why we wanted to obviously refresh them and get them digitized. So the SMP refresh was ensuring that the SMPs were technically reliable and reflected that latest evidence. So any of that evidence that needed to be reflected in all the SMPs from when they came to fruition in 2006 and 2012, improved that clarity of SMP management approaches. So what we did here, we introduced the subcategories. So that gave that more detail of what actually that the management approach meant on the ground. So management approaches such as hold the line or manage realignment, we introduced a subcategory just to give that more finite detail for the understanding at the level of the management approach. Also improve the accessibility of the SMPs through the development of SMP Explorer, so that digital tool which I'll talk about in a moment. And also supporting the update of the SMP action plans. As I've just said, all the SMPs have specific actions to actually get them delivered or towards delivery, such as the engagement, including any projects or strategies that need to be developed to actually work towards the management approach, especially if there needs to be a change of management approach in a certain area. Just to reiterate there, the SMP refresh was not changing the management approaches specifically SMPs, unless it was obviously needed during that time, and that was happening on the ground, and that was reflected in the updates. And it wasn't formally reconsulting and going out as a full reconsultation to communities and stakeholder groups. As I say, it was just a refresh, a rewrite, bringing everything up to date and making it digitized so it's easily accessible. Next slide, please. So yes, the final part of the SMP refresh was to make the SMPs easier to access and understand. So majority of you may have seen this slide many times before. So it's taking the picture that you can see on the left there. So a box of documents, hard to get through, hard to get that information out, probably just sat under a desk somewhere or on a shelf, and making it digitized in an easy to view and accessible format as what you can see on the right-hand screen there, which is the screenshot of SMP Explorer. Next slide, please. So yes, this was the final stage 2, the SMP refresh project, and this was the launch of SMP Explorer. This happened in January last year. As I said, it made the SMPs more accessible and easier to understand, mainly aimed at the coastal practitioner board and planners and decision makers. But obviously, with it being on .gov, this is open to the public, and it is there to help them understand the coastal risk and actions being taken in their areas. And then, as Nick stated, we introduced the NCERM, the Coastal Erosion Risk Map, onto SMP Explorer in January this year. Next slide, please. So what are we doing now with SMP? So we've done refresh, we've got everything dusted off and up to date and digitized. What are we doing now to actually keep that momentum going, keep SMPs alive and in front of people? So we are in the middle of the getting the SMP refresh into action project off the ground. This will run for the next 2 years. We held a scoping workshop in March last year with some coastal practitioners to start gaining the scope of what that actual project meant. And the aims of the project are to establish and embed the governance, including assurance, and explore resources to maintain those SMPs, facilitate the delivery of some of the priority actions that we identified during the SMP refresh in all the SMPs, and revisit some of the management approaches as suggested by the SMP Refresh health check. So during the refresh, all the SMPs had a health check, and where any locations were identified that a management approach needed to be changed, this is what we're looking at in this project, and actually working with coastal groups and SMP groups to actually help make those approaches and make those changes that where they're needed, and also improve the access, understanding, and the use of SMPs by coastal communities and wider coastal interests, including the webinar that you're on today. So this is one of those improvements and a detour to actually kind of drive the way forward to make the comms and engagement around SMPs more out there, more deliverable to a wider audience where it's needed. Next slide, please. So that was everything SMP was. Hopefully you've got a bit of understanding of what SMPs are, what we've done with them, and what we intend to do next. What I'll speak about now is the NCERM, so the National Coastal Erosion Risk Map, give you an introduction of what we've done with this project, and obviously where you can see how it fits with SMPs. So you've kind of got that baseline of what SMPs are, and now we've got the detail of the actual risk information that sits on the SMPs and on SMP Explorer. So next slide, please. So what is NCERM? So NCERM, as you can see on there, National Coastal Erosion Risk Map. Our previous NCERM was produced back in 2012. This only received a few minor updates in 2015 and 2017 and used only a basic assessment of property types. The new NCERM gives a better understanding and the picture of that coastal risk for England, and it also now includes climate change impacts on coastal erosion. Again, as SMPs and SMP Explorer, the aim is to be used by coastal practitioners, so planners, decision makers, but as it is on SMP Explorer, it's open to the public, and again, that makes it more accessible and meaningful to the public. And say it is available on SMP Explorer, so you can actually get to the detail via SMP Explorer direct, or you can get the link via .gov for check coastal erosion risk for an area in England. So that is the same link that you would have gone to previously. It just directs you now to the SMP Explorer page. Next slide, please. So the new NCERM has three variables, which when combined form the NCERM's erosion risk scenarios. So first, as you can see on screen there, the management scenario. So this is taken from the SMPs, and the user can either assume that the SMP will be implemented or assume that there'll be no future intervention. So that is, the SMP will be taken forward, the management approach, or assume that won't happen on the ground. So you can click those two scenarios on and off. Secondly, the climate change scenario. So you can select the present day climate where current rates of erosion are projected into the future, or two climate change scenarios of various levels of precaution. And then finally, as you can see in that third box on screen there, the time horizon. So you can select either the medium term to 2055, obviously that's where we are now in that medium term time frame, or the longer term to 2105. And both of these time periods are taken directly from the SMPs, as you've seen in the one of the previous slides that I've just mentioned. So going back, for that very first slide, I think it was, you've got those three time periods, and you can select the medium and the long term when you're looking at the time horizon on there. Next slide, please. So what improvements have we made to the NCERM? So the new Coastal Erosion Risk Map has incorporated several big improvements. The project has made use of the best available data and methods we can at that national scale, and it also uses data collected by the National Coastal Monitoring Programme, which provides a high resolution information on coastal change. We have used the latest climate science on sea level rise with new modelling approaches to show potential impacts on rates of erosion and on the deterioration of defences that prevent or reduce that erosion. Our approach has not allowed us to account for projected increases in rainfall and the subsequent impacts on groundwater and coastal landslides, and that is due to the inherent uncertainties and complexity of doing this. The NCERM projections use the new detail from the SMP refresh, and it also uses those management intents to shape the erosion projections. So taking all that information from SMP refresh and bringing it together to shape those erosion projections. All of the data that you will see of NCERM has been thoroughly verified by local authorities, and that was done during 2 rounds of engagement. And our new information provides an up-to-date picture of coastal erosion risk, which includes climate change impacts. As with the previous NCERM, we expect the new data to be used by yourselves and local planning authorities, and that will be used in preparing local plans to inform the creation of new and updates to existing coastal change management areas. I will go into that in detail in a few more slides, and just to highlight that this will be in more detail on Thursday's webinar in the tools and training one. We'll go into that in more detail regarding CCMAs. NCERM is also likely to be a key piece of evidence, but in itself doesn't say what development is appropriate in light of the coastal change risks. Again, I will go into that in a bit more detail of how you can use some of this information in your roles. Next slide, please. So I just wanted to provide this visualization of how the project has changed. So what you could see previously regarding NCERM to what you can see now. So the image on the left is the previous coastal erosion risk map. Going from that to the image on the right, as you can see, it's made the product easier to view, more intuitive, and it shows those erosion bandings easier and provides that visual quality for areas of potential risk. It also provides supportive data and text to aid better understanding, and it also includes specific help text on SMP Explorer itself. Next slide, please. So where can you find some of the detail to help you regarding NCERM? So we've got obviously the site itself, so you can check coastal erosion risk for an area in England. As I said before, you can go onto there, click that link, and it will take you directly through to SMP Explorer. That's the second link that you can see on the screen there. We've also updated our coastal handbook, and we've got specific pages on there which will support you in your roles. We've got supporting flood and coast projects, coastal change, specific NCERM pages, and also the new SharePoint site. I'll provide some more detail on that in a second regarding obviously what those kind of areas look like and the guidance and documentation on there to assist you in your role. Next slide, please. So yes, what information is available to you and kind of what are the next steps regarding the comms and engagement detail that you've heard today and you can hear for the rest of the week, and also some of the future detail of what's coming next regarding these projects. Next slide, please. So yeah, you can see some visual detail there on screen of support for your role. So specifically for Shoreline Management Plans, SMPs, we've got the Coastal Handbook, and there is a specific page on there for coastal planning and placemaking. What you need to do is request a link to the Coastal Handbook to actually gain access to there. It is a SharePoint site. Once you're in there, you've obviously got lots of information, lots of different libraries that you can go to. Just to highlight as well that the Coastal Handbook is a continuous live document and place of resource. So anything that comes is updated or is new, we will be updating the Coastal Handbook, and we're always looking for feedback for improvements on the Coastal Handbook as well. So yeah, once you do get access to that, if you've not already, do have a look around there and do provide feedback of the information that you'd like to see. The other screenshot on there is the SMP help page. So Shoreline Management Plans and Local Development Planning. When you're on SMP Explorer, that gives the full detail of a help page regarding the SMPs and their links to development planning. Next slide, please. And so similar to before, so obviously we've got the Coastal Handbook detail on there in the specific pages regarding NCERM. Also regarding NCERM, there is a specific QA document for LRMAs, Risk Management Authorities. That also details the NAFRA 2 detail as well, so Q&As for NCERM and NAFRA 2. We've also produced a specific planning guidance document to help you in your role using NCERM within your roles, and that is available as you can see on the Coastal Handbook there, and the links to that we'll share these. They'll be on the slides, and also we can share them within the chat as well. Next slide, please. Just aware of the time. Rattle through this. So yeah, without going into too much detail, because obviously there's the guidance in tools and training webinar that will be hosted on Thursday that will go into this in a bit more detail. So just some quick bullet points on there of how to use the information in your role. So the planning practice guidance to the MPPF gives a central role for SMPs, and that's setting out the evidence base for local planning decisions on the coast. NCERM provides that evidence to support that. So NCERM is that risk details, which is the evidence to support this. The MPPF requires consideration of coastal change issues within local plans, including coastal change management area designation and policies to support appropriate development. As I've stated, use SMP Explorer, the help pages within their coastal handbook, the RMA Q&A, and the specific guidance documents to assist you in your role. And I'll quickly go into what's coming next and the updates. If you just go to the next slide, please. Oh, sorry, just before we get to that, some more information to consider in your role. So just highlight that on SMP Explorer under the related links tab, local strategies, monitoring and other initiatives will be highlighted on there, so you can have direct links to that. If there's anything within that specific location that you're looking at, if you've got a planning application or a local plan, if there's anything else relating to that area, if it's highlighted within the action plan tab, as you can see on screen, and also a related link, they should be in there, so you can go directly to that to find that information out. Obviously, as Nick said at the start of the call, the flood risk information. So obviously we updated the flood map for planning service in March this year. And also to consider the other plans that you need to consider in your role regarding any planning applications and such. So obviously marine plans and marine licenses, if there's a need for marine license, and obviously the consideration for planning application if it's on that coastal area, and obviously our river basin management plans as well. And again, just to highlight those help pages on SMP Explorer, and there's also the SMP full supplementary guidance documentation as well. And final slide from me before Hugh comes in. So yeah, what's next? So we've obviously got this full coastal webinar series. So this is the first one of these. We've got the elected members one tomorrow. And again, just highlight the tools and training one on Thursday. Again, that will go into some more detail of actually using the detail within your role, local plans, planning applications, CCMA designations and updates. We're also producing a coastal e-learning module, which will sit on the TCPA website. The date for that is still TBC. Highlighting again the SMP Next Steps Refresh into Action project. So as I stated, a lot of the detail on there is some of the comms and engagement, training resources, really just updating and highlighting some of the changes that have been made and we're looking to make, and just to keep SMPs and the risk information alive and out there and used. And another plug for the Coastal Handbook to actually get on there, have a look around at the resources available. And yeah, grateful for any feedback on the improvements and anything that you would actually like to see that potentially is missing on there that would help you, support you in your role. And that links back to the SMP Next Steps Refresh project as well. I'll stop talking now and I'll hand back to you, Hugh, to do the Q&A. But yeah, thanks everyone for listening. Yeah, happy to take some questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rachel, so much for the incredible job of getting through all that material, and thanks, Nick, as well. Can I ask all of our Environment Agency colleagues to sort of join me and turn their cameras on just while we deal with the Q&A problem, because I know we might be swapping around in terms of who might answer. We've got some Slido questions, which I'm going to group together because we are quite short of time, and the most important set are actually really practical ones. How can people join the seminar next Thursday? Where is the link to the Coastal Handbook? And are these slides going to be shared? And I think the answer to the final question is clearly yes, and that's got some of this information in it, hasn't it?
Do you want me to take that one?
Go for it, Rachel.
Yeah. So slides will be distributed for those on the call that have registered. Also, this recording will be made available on the TCPA YouTube channel, I believe, and also it will be on the resource channel as well. Yeah, so that will be available there. what was the other question, Hugh?
It's
Sorry.
in the chat. Thank you. It's all right though. Thank you, TCPA. There's a little message just gone in the chat on the Zoom, which takes you to the link for Thursday's session. But I think it was the other thing, Rachel, was about the link to the Coastal Handbook and those courses. So I had a number of questions on seminars about how people can get all this information.
Yeah, so the Coastal Handbook, we'll put in that in the chat, and also we can distribute it as well. It will also be available on the slides. You can click the links on those slides which had the Coastal Handbook. That will take you to there. But I'm assuming Eleanor might be able to come in on here and say, yeah, we'll be putting it in the chat as well. So you've got that direct link there. The webinar on Thursday. So however you signed up for this on the events page on the TCPA website, go back on there. We can also put the link in as well and sign up for that webinar on Thursday.
And just as a quick follow-up, because I'm trying to do multitasking, which I'm bad at, there's some questions at the very end now related to that about the date of the Coastal Handbook, 2010. Is that the one? Is that the version people should be looking at?
No, so this is why we've actually digitized the Coastal Handbook and why it's on a SharePoint site. So that Coastal Handbook was the very first one, the original one, the PDF document. So we've taken all of that plus more information, put it onto a SharePoint site, and that is the SharePoint site where we'll be putting the link in that you can see it. So that is obviously still relevant information, but this one is new, updated, refreshed, and additional information in the digitized Coastal Handbook.
Right. So just to be really clear, for the hard of thinking of which I am, 2010, no. SharePoint site, yes. And access to the SharePoint site is from where?
So if you so once you get the link, you'll have to request access and then go through the channels from outside. Yeah.
Right. Okay. Thanks, Sam. I'm sorry to labour the point, but it seems like really important. Everyone's got the right resources, isn't it, in front of them for doing this really important task. So in relation to some of the other Slido questions, just quickly, there's a group of questions which relate to a really important issue about the pressures for coastal planners. But there's a lot of pressure on housing development and housing growth. And obviously a tremendous amount of the managing risk, managing the future spatial, the shape of those communities depends on shoreline management plans, but it also depends on their implementation. So how confident, I think this relates to a group of questions, how confident can we be that the actions in the SMPs are going to happen? And in a particular circumstance, just to make your lives even more difficult from the agency, let's say we're allocating 10,000 homes, dependent on SMP actions or dependent on flood risk. What level of security and knowledge, what safety do we have as planners in making those allocations when SMPs might not be fully funded? Nobody wants that one. Who'd like to try and have a go? I'm going to pick on Andrew, I think, only. Nick, sorry, Nick, you volunteered. Thank you so much.
I will kick off. It's a complex question in some ways, and so I'm sure that Andrew and Rachel will have something to add to my answer. But I'll kick off. In a word, the actions in SMPs and the management policies, local policies, if you like, management approaches in SMPs, so hold the line, manager alignment, are not guaranteed funding. So that's the sort of top level answer to them. SMPs are not statutory to produce. So it's, no one has a duty to produce shoreline management plans legally. They've been done as a matter of policy from DEFRA. They actually emerged from local authorities originally, even going back to the 1980s, but certainly sort of in the 1990s, becoming sort of more of a sort of formation around the country. And then MAF, as it was, said, right, this is a good idea, quite bottom up, sort of trying to join up. That's really good. Let's harness that energy from local authorities and try and do it more consistently. And there was a first run of them, and then they were, done quite well, but essentially tended to say, well, we'll just carry on indefinitely doing what we're doing now. And DEFRA, as it became, said, I don't think that's going to be sustainable. Can we go and do these again? And so came the second iteration, which is what we have now. And they were done as a matter of policy rather than statute. So they're not even statutory to produce, although we are looking at that with DEFRA, because we want to make sure there is that resource there committed from risk management authorities to maintain them, make sure that they're demonstrably up to date, that people can have confidence that this is the direction of travel that has been discussed and agreed. But they would even then still not be statutory to implement, in the sense that they're looking to 2100 and beyond. So how can you make it a legal duty to implement something like that? We don't plan, even in the planning world, you think a lot further into the future than most people do, and that even then you're actually often thinking in less, smaller time periods than that in some cases. So most people are thinking about investment in the next 5 years or so. So 100 years is pretty demanding in terms of them being kind of statutory. So in that sense, there isn't an investment program for that length of time, and so they can't be guaranteed. However, that said, what we do need is SMPs which are agreed, are adopted locally by local planning authorities, that have been signed off by the Environment Agency as sensible, and there is a view that they should be affordable, but we will need to constantly highlight the risks from climate change that compound the existing risks that we have already, so that we can secure a good amount of investment into achieving their ambitions and their objectives and that direction of travel. So it's basically based on a kind of top level affordability assessment, if you like, or cost effectiveness assessment in SMPs. Each management approach in each individual location isn't subject to a detailed cost benefits or cost effectiveness appraisal like a individual project would be, for example. You don't get kind of cost benefit analysis in SMPs in any detailed sense. They're strategic plans. So it's more a question of what is the most sustainable and appropriate direction of travel in this area of coast.
Okay.
Nick, we now need to make that affordable. So that's the top level answer. I don't know if Andrew and Rachel want to add anything to that.
Well, I'm going to make it even more difficult because I'm acting as clown for our audience, if you like, at the moment. But what troubles me about it, and I know what troubles practitioners, if we're trying to make a local plan with flood risk climate guidance in the NPPF, NPPG saying safe over its whole lifetime, 100 years, it's the assumption behind that. How can I build a local plan if I don't know the SMP is going to deliver a hold the line policy that it says it's going to deliver? And I think it's really, I'm not deliberately trying to be difficult. I'm just trying to tease out the awfulness of local planning and difficulty of squaring housing pressures with the fact that we don't have that fully funded program. So what should I do as a local planner? Should I not allocate the housing and wait for the certainty, or should I do the housing and gamble? Andrew, what's the answer to that?
Go for it, Andrew. Yeah, bring in CCMAs.
Good afternoon, everyone. Yeah, I'm a development planning advisor at the Environment Agency. So I'll start the local plan end of it and then work back to SMPs just to give us a different direction. So firstly, local plans should seek opportunities to potentially relocate development that might be at risk in the long term, considering both flood risk and coastal erosion issues. So that builds into another question that's already on the Slido. That the nature of the risk that you see in a particular location is like to be quite different across the country. So first piece of advice is to seek advice from relevant experts. That is looking at the Environment Agency, Coast Protection Authority, other stakeholders, even local communities. They all have a stakeholder in this kind of field of work. If you're looking at the flood risk side of it, and starting with that, your strategic flood risk assessment should provide you with information that can help you understand the scale and severity of that risk in coastal environments. And that should also include tidal information if you've got estuaries, tidal rivers, things like that. If you have a SFRA that doesn't have those things, this is a good prompt to ask you to go check those things, potentially refresh. There's loads of advice out there on SFRAs. You could check your local plan to see if it has something called a coastal change management area, or a CCMA for short. CCMAs are basically a way of identifying where there are areas that could be affected by physical changes at the coast. So this could include coastal erosion, it could include ground instability, it can include areas that might be permanently inundated as a result of sea level rise. So CCMAs are a good way of implementing something through the local plan that takes account of those coastal change issues. And Rach and I are going to talk about CCMAs more on Thursday, so I don't want to give you too much right now, but basically CCMAs should be designated in areas that have naturally eroding frontages, where you should be considering that coastal erosion. There's also guidance in the PPG about what to do in areas that are more uncertain. So areas where, like we've just been saying, there might be hold the line, but there are uncertainties about whether that is achievable. So we'll talk about more of that on Thursday. If I could give you 3 takeaways for now. One is check to see if you've got a local plan policy around coastal change, including those CCMAs. If you have a CCMA, have a look at what it talks about. How does it use the SMPs? So in general, they should use them as a signpost. There should be other information building up behind it. And the third one is to check if your strategic flood risk assessment is up to date. And if it's not, start that refresh and review process. Back to you, Hugh. Hopefully I've answered your question.
Thank you very much. It's complicated, right, isn't it? But I think fundamentally that core question, well, perhaps I'll come back to it just before we end. One final one we can pick up from the Slido before we go back to Eleanor for our final Slido poll, which I feel happy I've managed to remember. There's a number of questions about opportunities to be more positive, or at least I think that's what they're about. What's the relationship between actions in the SMP, particular nature-based solutions, and biodiversity net gain or local nature recovery strategies? What is it? What's the thinking about the integration of those things that's running at the moment in the agency? Who would like to respond? Rachel?
Yeah, I'll kick off, and then if Nick wants to add anything onto that. So as part of the Next Steps project, we're really looking into integrating one of the projects that's running alongside this, which is the Habitat Compensation Restoration project, and actually looking what's happening there and how we can utilise some of that within the SMP. So as I stated regarding those locations where that policy or that management approach needs to change, is that something that the HCRP has identified as well as a location, and can we kind of tease that out and lean into it? Also, as you've stated, obviously BNG, LNRSs actually getting the detail down and involved in that regarding the SMPs and where we're going and the actions within there, and not just looking at the SMPs as that blanket, actually looking all the initiatives and details and projects and everything, and have that holistic view of what's going on the ground that will inform some of those changes that are needed, and also that direction of travel. So is it a management approach that, say, needs to buy some time to actually get to that management approach? Is it a managed realignment project for the medium term? But we can't obviously just go straight into that change from a hold the line to a managed realignment change. What do we need to do to try and buy some time within there? Is that something that these initiatives and projects can actually lean into it and using it as a whole, and also looking at some of the triggers rather than just this is where we are, it's 2025, let's go into the next one, looking at triggers as well, obviously, as we're working through. Hopefully that's answered it. So the main takeaway from that is just to have, really bringing in that holistic view of what's happening, leaning into the other projects that are obviously there, and integrating it as a whole as much as we can, rather than just taking all these bits of projects and information and siloing them out, bringing them all together, and actually, trying to tease it out of what we can do all together.
Yeah, it's a general rule about talking to each other is a fine idea, isn't it? I think in general in policy making. I'm going to draw things a little bit to a close because Eleanor, I'm just giving you a heads up. Let's move perhaps to our final poll because we're within the last sort of 5 minutes. So I'm going to hand back to you, and so over to you for the poll.
Yeah, that's great. Can we move the slide on? It's still the same place, so slido.com, TCPA1. I can see that there's been loads of you in there, so 100 people voting on the first bit, which is great, and thank you very much for your questions. I've seen a couple of emails come through already as well around accessing the Coastal Handbook. So if you do email that Coastal Resilience email address that I shared, we will pick it up. I will have to share it with the person at our end that manages access. But if you send an email to that, I will pick it up. So yeah, just be assured of that. I can see that we've already got nearly 70 votes on the question that I've just opened on Slido. So the question for you after hearing all of the information about SMPs and NCERM around, after this webinar, will you now go and look at SMPs and NCERM online to support you in your role? And great to see that out of now 77, 78, it keeps going up. We've got 91% of you saying yes. So hopefully you will go and access some of those materials that Rachel has mentioned during the call. Have a look at the Coastal Handbook. And yeah, that's great to hear such a positive response. So thank you very much. And Hugh, I'll pass back to you.
Thanks very much. Can I just say a sincere thanks to all our Environment Agency colleagues. My top bits of advice to finish this session are make friends with the Environment Agency. Their resources are pretty short, but it's a vital relationship between local authorities and the agency to get this right. The second bit of advice I would give you all is that this is complicated. There are multiple data sets. Never forget your key role in creating public safety and sustainability. In many of the communities we're talking about, there is seriously, although an agency can't say it, but I'm so old I can say it, there is literally an argument about whether these places will be there or not there by the end of the century. The reason that planning is so important is it's your job to be able to guide a pathway for the sustainable future of these places. And in many cases, given the past, in particular on the East Coast in terms of storm surge, these are life and death issues, which is why planning is such an important discipline. My own personal professional advice, which is not the agency's, but is mine myself, is to be precautionary in answering the question, is it growth over safety and sustainability? It's not simply an environmental question. It's a matter of personal safety for people who live in these places. But it's also an economic question. Never forget that nothing that you consent or allocate now in terms of housing will benefit from the flood reinsurance compact. If you get it wrong, you have a social and economic disaster on your hands, just to, brighten your days. But the real incentive behind that is it does mean that your jobs are the most important in these places. That long-term approach to sustainable development and managing climate change means that you have to answer these questions well, and you have to be satisfied that you've answered them well. That takes time and it takes resource. All I can do is wish you the very best with that. And although there is so much noise around planning reform and changes to planning at the moment, be forensically focused on your top priority in coastal communities, which is their future long-term survival in the context of severe climate change. So I want to thank all of our speakers. I want to thank all of the staff at the TCPA behind this session. The slides will be made available, and I commend the session that will take place on Thursday, where you'll get into even more technical detail about how to bring some solutions out of this. So thank you all very much.